What is that thing? It's enormous. Our scans indicate
superior firepower. We've made a terrible mistake.
The void between stars held no mercy for the weak, a lesson the Cathai supremacy had taught countless species across 3 galactic arms. Admiral Zextera stood on the command deck of the Sharthak, his 6-fingered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the tactical display with the cold satisfaction of a predator observing cornered prey. The crimson glow of the display cast harsh shadows across his chitinous features, highlighting the ceremonial scarification that marked his rank among the supremacy's warrior caste. Contact bearing 27 Mark IV, Admiral reported navigation. Officer Kithfeld, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had announced the discovery of hundreds of primitive civilizations. Single vessel, unknown configuration. Fusion signature suggests basic interstellar capability. Zexthura's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his species. Another backwater civilization stumbling through space with technology barely advanced enough to leave their home system. The Cathai had encountered dozens of such species in their expansion through this region of space. Most surrendered immediately upon witnessing the supremacy's technological superiority. Those that didn't were simply eliminated, he inquired. Moving to the tactical station where Subcommander Thelahast was already inputting scan parameters into the ship's advanced sensor array. Approximately 2 light minutes, Admiral, the vessel appears to be on a survey trajectory through the outer system. Thelahast paused, studying the initial readings with a frown. Curious, the ship's configuration doesn't match any known design patterns in our databases. Show me. The main display shifted, magnifying the distant contact until it resolved into a crude, 3-dimensional representation. Zexthura studied the vessel with growing disdain. It was massive, certainly nearly a kilometer in length, but its construction appeared barbarically primitive. The hull was composed of what looked like overlapping metal plates, welded together in layers that suggested either poor manufacturing techniques or a complete lack of understanding regarding proper structural engineering. Crude fusion drives flickered at the vessel's stern, their inefficient plasma trails leaving a visible signature that any competent military would have eliminated centuries ago. Pathetic, Zextara muttered, watching the ship lumber through space with all the grace of a wounded leviathan. Look at those weapon mounts those projectile weapons. Subcommander Thelahas manipulated the display, highlighting several protrusions along the vessel's hull. Preliminary scans suggest kinetic acceleration systems. Yes, primitive magnetic coils, by the look of them. The energy signatures are so low, our sensors almost missed them entirely. The bridge crew exchanged glances of barely concealed mirth. Kinetic weapons were considered obsolete by any civilization that had mastered basic energy manipulation. The Cathai had abandoned such crude implements millennia ago in favor of plasma cannons and particle beams that could slice through ship hulls at the molecular level. Shields, Zexthera asked, though he already suspected the answer. Electromagnetic barriers only, Thelahas confirmed. No deflector arrays, no gravitational manipulation, no quantum disruption fields, just basic electromagnetic repulsion. A single plasma burst from our secondary batteries would overwhelm their entire defensive grid. Zexthera clicked his mandibles. Again, this time with genuine amusement. The vessel before them wasn't just primitive, it was laughably so. Its designers had clearly never encountered a truly advanced military force. The ship's hull was covered in what appeared to be sensor arrays and communication equipment, suggesting a scientific or exploration vessel rather than a warship. Even their attempt at armor plating looked like something cobbled together from mining equipment. Admiral Communications Officer, Velther announced from her station. We're receiving a transmission from the unknown vessel. They're broadcasting on primitive radio frequencies. Audio, Zextara commanded, curious to hear what these primitives had to say. A voice filled the bridge, speaking in a language the ship's computers quickly translated. The tone was calm, almost casual, with an underlying confidence that struck Zextara as oddly misplaced given the circumstances. Unknown vessels, this is Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth ship Indomitable. You have entered the Centauri system, which is under the protection of the Terran Federation. We come in peace and request that you identify yourselves and state your intentions in this system. Zexthora's compound eyes widened slightly. The audacity was almost refreshing. Here was a single primitive vessel armed with obsolete weapons, and protected by shields that wouldn't stop a mining laser demanding that the Cathay supremacy identify themselves. He had to admire the creature's courage, even if their stupidity was equally impressive. Terran Federation, he mused aloud. Another species that believes themselves capable of claiming stellar territory. How... Quaint. Should we respond, Admiral? Velthar asked. Not yet. I want to know more about these... humans. Before we introduce them to the reality of galactic politics, Zexthera turned to his science officer. Morthic, initiate a full tactical scan of their vessel. I want to know everything's structural composition, crew complement, weapon capabilities, power generation, even their biological signatures. If we're going to add another species to our collection, we should at least understand what we're dealing with. Science Officer Morthic's tentacles danced across his console with practiced efficiency. Initiating deep scan protocols, Admiral. Estimated completion in 6 minutes. The bridge fell into a routine, quiet as the Sharthak's advanced sensor array began its work. Waves of exotic particles and quantum probes swept across the void, penetrating the human vessel's primitive defenses with contemptuous ease. The Cathay scanning technology was among the most sophisticated in the galaxy, capable of mapping a target down to the molecular level. No secret could hide from their sensors. No defensive measure could block their probes. Preliminary biological readings are interesting, Morthic reported after a few minutes. The crew appears to be bipedal, carbon-based, with what looks like an internal skeletal structure. Approximately 200 individuals aboard. Their biological signatures are ... active. Active how? Zexthora asked, though he wasn't particularly interested in the alien's physiology. Elevated heart rates, increased neural activity, heightened adrenaline production. They appear to be in a state of excitement, anticipation. The patterns don't match fear or stress responses we've documented in other species. Zexthera dismissed the observation with a wave of his hand. Primitive species often reacted strangely to their first contact with advanced civilizations. Some cowered in terror, others became irrationally aggressive. Excitement was simply another variation on the theme. Continue the scan, he ordered. I want to know every weakness, every vulnerability. When we're finished studying them, we'll give them one chance to surrender before we add their system to the supremacy. What Admiral Zexthera didn't know was that his deep scan was revealing far more than he realized. As the Cathay sensors probed deeper into the Indomitable's structure, they began to uncover layer upon layer of redundant systems, backup protocols, and hidden capabilities that defied their understanding of primitive engineering. The ship's true nature, carefully concealed behind facades of crude construction and obsolete technology, was about to become terrifyingly clear. But for now, the Cathay remained blissfully ignorant of the trap they were walking into. The first anomaly appeared 3 minutes into the deep scan, manifesting as a minor discrepancy in the structural analysis that Science Officer Morthic initially dismissed as sensor drift. The human vessel's hull composition readings fluctuated between mundane steel alloys and something far more sophisticated, a material that shouldn't exist in a civilization still using fusion drives and kinetic weapons. Admiral Morthic said, his tentacles pausing over the console as he studied the readings. I'm detecting inconsistencies in the vessel's construction. The outer hull appears to be composed of standard ferrous alloys, but the underlying structure, it's showing properties I don't recognize. Zexthera barely glanced up from his tactical display, where he was reviewing deployment patterns for the conquest of the Centauri system. Sensor calibration error. These primitives couldn't have developed metamaterials without mastering energy. Manipulation first. Continue the scan. But Morthic's frown deepened as more data streamed across his displays. The human ship's internal structure was becoming increasingly difficult to map. Where he expected to find simple corridors and basic living quarters, the scans revealed a labyrinthine network of passages that seemed to serve no logical purpose. Multiple redundant pathways connected every section of the ship, creating a maze-like interior that defied conventional shipbuilding principles. Sir, the internal layout is unusual, Morthic reported, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was rare for a Cathay science officer. There are far more corridors than necessary. For a ship this size, the redundancy is excessive, almost as if they expected significant portions of the vessel to be destroyed and still wanted to maintain connectivity between all sections. Subcommander Thelahas looked up from his weapons station, mandibles clicking. With amusement, paranoid engineering. Probably primitive species often overbuild their vessels out of fear and ignorance. The explanation satisfied Zextera's expectations, but Morthic found himself increasingly troubled by what he was seeing. The human ship wasn't just over-engineered, was designed according to principles that seemed to prioritize survival over efficiency, redundancy over elegance. Every critical system had not just one backup, but multiple layers of backup systems, each capable of independent operation. The power distribution network is extensive, Morthic continued, his tone becoming more uncertain with each revelation. I count 17 separate fusion reactors, all operating at minimal capacity. The total power generation capability far exceeds what would be necessary for a vessel of this configuration. Inefficient design, Zextera replied dismissively. They haven't learned to optimize their energy systems. But as the scan progressed deeper into the ship's core systems, Morthic began to suspect that the humans' approach to energy management wasn't inefficient, was deliberate. The multiple reactors weren't running at minimal capacity because they were poorly designed. They were running at minimal capacity because they were meant to surge to full power on demand. The power distribution network could reroute energy to any system on the ship within seconds, turning what appeared to be a sluggish exploration vessel into something far more capable, Admiral Morthic said, his voice tight with growing concern. I'm detecting weapon systems that don't match our initial assessment. Now Zextera did look up, his compound eyes focusing on the science officer with sharp attention. Explain. The kinetic accelerators we identified earlier, they're not as primitive as we thought. The magnetic coils are superconducting rated for energies that would require massive power draws if they were to channel their full reactor output through these systems. Morthic's tentacles danced over his console, running calculations that made his bioluminescent patches flicker with stress. The projectile velocities would be significant, potentially dangerous to our shields if fired in concentrated volleys. Thelahas snorted with derision. Kinetic weapons are still kinetic weapons, regardless of their velocity. Our deflector arrays can handle anything these primitives can throw at us. But Morthic was no longer listening to the tactical officer's dismissive commentary. His attention was focused on the most disturbing discovery yet, the biological scans of the human crew. The initial readings had indicated elevated stress responses, which he had attributed to the natural fear any primitive species would feel when confronted by superior technology. But as the scan analyzed the crew's physiological states in greater detail, a different picture emerged. The crew's biological signatures are anomalous, Morthic reported, his voice dropping to a whisper that nonetheless carried across the bridge. Their stress indicators aren't consistent with fear or panic. Elevated heart rates, yes, but accompanied by increased oxygen consumption, heightened neural activity in regions associated with problem-solving, and chemical releases that suggest anticipation rather than terror. The bridge fell silent as the implications of this observation sank in. Every species the Cathai had encountered responded to their presence with either submission or desperate aggression born of fear. But the humans appeared to be experiencing something entirely different. They were excited. Perhaps they don't understand the danger they're in, Velthor suggested from her communications station. Their primitive technology might not be capable of accurately assessing our capabilities. Morthic's patches flickered more rapidly as he delved deeper into the biological data. No, that's not it. Look at this. He transferred the scan data to the main display, showing a three-dimensional representation of the human crew's locations throughout the ship. They're not randomly distributed. Everyone is moving to specific positions. Battle stations, they're preparing for combat. The revelation hit Admiral Zextera like a physical blow. He had assumed that the humans' calm diplomatic transmission was either ignorance or bravado, but the scan data suggested something far more troubling. These creatures weren't afraid because they believed they could fight. More disturbing still, they seemed to be looking forward to it. Continue the scan, Zextera ordered, his voice harder now. I want to know everything about this vessel. If these primitives think they can challenge the supremacy, They're about to learn a painful lesson. But as Morthic pushed the sensors to their maximum resolution, the true scope of the human's deception began to emerge. Hidden beneath the crude external plating, the ship's true structure revealed itself. Armor systems that incorporated reactive elements point defense networks that had been disguised as communication arrays, and weapon systems that existed in configurations the Cathai had never encountered. Admiral Morthic whispered, his voice barely audible above the bridge's ambient noise. "This isn't an exploration vessel. The scan is revealing ... This is a warship, a dreadnought-class battleship, disguised to look primitive." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Zextera stared at the tactical display, watching as the scan data rewrote everything he thought he knew about the human vessel. The crude plating was camouflage, concealing armor systems that could probably withstand plasma cannon fire. The primitive weapons were anything but primitive. They were kinetic accelerators, capable of firing projectiles at relativistic velocities. The excessive redundancy wasn't poor engineering. It was battlefield survivability, taken to an extreme he had never imagined possible. And the Cruthia-excited anticipatory crew weren't afraid because they knew exactly what their ship was capable of. Sir Thelaha said, his voice tight with concern, "If this is accurate, we may have made a strategic error. We should consider withdrawing until we can bring additional fleet elements to bear." But Zextora's pride wouldn't allow him to show weakness in front of a primitive species, even one that had managed to surprise him with their deception. The Cathai supremacy had never retreated from a single enemy vessel, regardless of its capabilities. Their technology was still superior, their numbers were still overwhelming, and their experience in galactic warfare was measured in millennia. He said firmly, "We will not be intimidated by clever camouflage and psychological warfare. These humans may be more cunning than we initially assessed, but they are still primitive. Order the fleet to battle positions. We will show them what happens when a species attempts to deceive the supremacy." What Admiral Zextera didn't realize was that the scan he had ordered was still revealing new layers of the human's true nature. Deep within the ship's core, protected by redundant armor systems and concealed behind false bulkheads, lay weapons and defensive systems that would redefine his understanding of warfare itself. The humans had spent centuries perfecting not just the art of war, but the art of appearing weak when they were actually strong. And now, thanks to his own arrogance, he was about to discover exactly what that meant. The second transmission from the human vessel arrived as the Cathai fleet moved into attack formation. Their sleek warships arranging themselves in the traditional supremacy battle pattern, a three-dimensional diamond that maximized overlapping fields of fire while minimizing exposure to enemy weapons. Admiral Zextera watched his tactical display with grim satisfaction as 12 heavy cruisers and 36 destroyer-class vessels took their positions, their hulls gleaming with the cold light of charged plasma cannons. Incoming transmission. From the human vessel, Communications Officer Velthar announced, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had relayed countless surrender offers from doomed civilizations. Audio Zextera commanded, expecting to hear the panicked pleas of a primitive species finally understanding the magnitude of their situation. Instead, Captain Sarah Chen's voice filled the bridge with the same calm confidence that had characterized her first transmission. If anything, she sounded slightly amused. "Admiral Zexthora of the Cathai Supremacy," she began, and the alien commander's mandibles clicked with surprise that she knew his name and rank. "Your deep scan protocols are quite sophisticated. I'm impressed. Most species we encounter can't penetrate our outer hull composition, let alone map our internal structure. You've seen what we really are now, haven't you?" The casual tone sent a chill through the bridge crew. This wasn't the voice of someone facing overwhelming odds. This was the voice of someone who believed they held all the cards. "I'll be direct with you, Admiral," Captain Chen continued. "You have approximately 48 vessels in your battle group. Impressive firepower, advanced shields, excellent crew coordination. Under normal circumstances, you'd be facing a significant tactical challenge, but these aren't normal circumstances." Zexthora's compound eyes narrowed as he studied the lone human vessel on his display. Despite their revelations about its true nature, it remained a single ship against his entire fleet. The human's confidence was either the result of severe psychological instability or knowledge of capabilities that his scans had somehow missed. You see, Admiral, the UES Indomitable isn't just a battleship. It's a testing platform. Everything you're about to experience has been designed, refined, and perfected over centuries of human warfare. We've fought wars you couldn't imagine, survived conflicts that would have destroyed most civilizations, and learned to thrive in situations where survival itself seems impossible. The transmission paused, and in that silence, Zexera could hear something that made his bioluminescent patches flicker with UNISA sound of quiet activity in the background, orders being given in calm, professional tones. The distinctive hum of weapon systems powering up, the measured breathing of a crew preparing for combat with the practiced efficiency of seasoned warriors. "We are not your enemy, Admiral Zex," Captain Chen resumed, her voice taking on a slightly more serious tone. "We didn't come here to fight you. We came here to explore, to learn, to hopefully make contact with new civilizations in the spirit of mutual cooperation. But you've made that impossible." Subcommander Velahas leaned forward in his chair, his tactical training warring with the growing unease in his chest. "Admiral, their weapons are still powered down. Shields are at minimum. If we're going to strike now would be the optimal time." But Zextera raised a hand for silence, his attention focused entirely on the human captain's words. There was something in her tone, quality he couldn't quite identify, that suggested layers of meaning beneath her diplomatic language. "Here's what's going to happen," Captain Chen continued, and now her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded in battle many times before. "I'm going to give you one chance, one single opportunity to power down your weapons, withdraw your fleet, and leave this system. If you do that, this conversation ends here. You return to your space, we return to ours, and we pretend this misunderstanding never happened." The bridge erupted in quiet clicks and chittering as the Cathai officers expressed their disbelief at the humans' audacity. A single primitive vessel demanding that the entire supremacy fleet withdraw. It was beyond arrogance, it was insanity. "But if you choose to attack," Captain Chen's voice cut through their chatter like a blade. "If you force us to defend ourselves, then you need to understand exactly what that means. We won't just fight you, Admiral. We'll study you. We'll learn. From you, we'll adapt to everything you throw at us and use it to become better at destroying you." The transmission paused again, and this time the background sounds painted a clearer picture of the human vessel's interior. Blast doors slamming shut, equipment being secured, the distinctive whine of power being rerouted to combat systems. Most disturbing of all, the sound of human voices, not panicked or afraid, but excited, eager. "You see, Admiral, humans don't just prepare for war. We prepare for every possible variation of war. Every scenario you can imagine, we've already planned for. Every tactic you might employ, we've already countered. Every weakness you might try to exploit, we've already turned into a strength." Zextara's mandibles clicked involuntarily as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. The humans weren't just confident, they were anticipating multiple possible battle scenarios and relishing the opportunity to test their preparations against a real opponent. "We've been monitoring your formation patterns since you began your approach," Captain Chen continued, her voice now carrying a note of something that sounded almost like fondness. "Classic Cathai diamond formation, optimized for overlapping PLASMA cannon coverage. Excellent tactical doctrine, by the way. We've studied it extensively. Would you like to know how many ways we've found to counter it?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Zextera felt his bioluminescent patches dimming as the true scope of the human's preparation became clear. They hadn't just stumbled into this encounter. They had been studying his people, learning their tactics, preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. 17 different approaches. Captain Chen answered her own question. "We've identified 17 distinct methods for defeating a Cathai diamond formation, each tailored to different scenarios and resource constraints. The one we're about to demonstrate is particularly effective against fleets of your size and composition," Admiral Morthic whispered from his science station, his voice tight with growing alarm. "The human vessel. It's beginning to change. The whole configuration is shifting. Those aren't just armor plates, they're modular sections that can be rearranged in real time." On the tactical display, the human ship was transforming before their eyes. What had appeared to be a crude, blocky vessel was revealing itself as something far more sophisticated, modular design that could reconfigure itself for different combat roles. Weapon ports were opening along the hull, revealing systems that their scans had somehow missed. Point defense arrays were extending from hidden compartments, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make approach runs suicidal. "This is your last warning, Admiral," Captain Chen said, her voice now carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Withdraw now while you still can, because in approximately 30 seconds, I'm going to give my weapons officer permission to demonstrate why humans are considered the most dangerous species in this galaxy." The transmission ended, leaving the Cathay bridge in stunned silence. Zexthera stared at the tactical display, watching as the human vessel completed its transformation from apparent cargo hauler to something that looked like it had been designed by warriors who understood war on a fundamental level that his people had never achieved. Admiral Thelahas said quietly, "Perhaps we should consider—" "No," Zexthera snapped, his pride finally overriding his growing sense of unease. "Will not be intimidated by psychological warfare and clever engineering. They are still one ship against our entire fleet. Their confidence is nothing but bluster designed to make us doubt ourselves." He straightened in his command chair, his mandibles clicking with forced authority. "All vessels, prepare to engage. Target their propulsion systems, first Taiwan. Them disabled, not destroyed. When they're helpless, we'll board them and show the galaxy what happens to species that dare threaten the supremacy." But, as his fleet prepared to attack, Zexthara couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make the worst mistake of his career. The humans' calm confidence, their detailed knowledge of Cathay tactics, their apparent eagerness for battle, all pointed to a level of preparation that suggested they had been planning for this exact scenario. In the final moments before the attack began, as plasma cannons charged and targeting systems locked onto the human vessel, Admiral Zexthera wondered if Captain Chen's warning had been genuine concern for his crew's welfare, or simply the professional courtesy of one warrior giving another the chance to avoid needless slaughter. He was about to find out which one it was. The attack order hung on his lips, and in that moment of hesitation, Zexthera realized that the humans had already won their first victory. They had made him doubt himself, made him question the superiority that had carried the supremacy to conquest across 3 galactic arms. But pride, as always, proved stronger than wisdom. "All vessels," he commanded, his voice. The first volley of Cathay plasma fire lit up the void between the fleets like a miniature star going nova. 48 vessels discharged their primary weapons simultaneously, sending torrents of superheated plasma racing toward the lone human battleship at nearly the speed of light. The coordinated barrage represented enough raw energy to vaporize a small moon, delivered with the precision that had made the Cathay supremacy the dominant military force in 3 galactic arms. Admiral Zexthera watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction as the plasma streams converged on their target. No single vessel could survive that kind of concentrated firepower. The EU's Indomitable would be reduced to constituent atoms in seconds, and this embarrassing episode would become nothing more than a footnote in the supremacy's glorious expansion. The plasma impact should have been instantaneous. Instead, something impossible happened. The human vessel's hull began to glow, not with the harsh white light of vaporization, but with a soft, almost pleasant blue radiance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the incoming energy streams. The plasma that should have torn through their primitive armor was instead being absorbed, channeled, and redirected through systems that shouldn't have been possible with their level of technology. "What?" Zexthara began. But his words were cut short as the absorbed energy was suddenly discharged in a brilliant cascade of lightning that arced between the Indomitable's hull plates before dissipating harmlessly into space. "Impossible." "Sub-Commander," Thelahas whispered, his mandibles clicking rapidly with stress. But Science Officer Morthic was already providing the answer, his tentacles dancing over his console as he analyzed the sensor data from the attack. "The hull composition isn't what we thought. Those aren't armor plates, they're energy redistribution matrices. The entire ship's surface is one massive capacitor array designed to absorb and channel directed energy weapons." The revelation hit the bridge like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just built a warship, they had built a warship specifically designed to counter the Cathai's primary weapon systems. Every element of their technology, every apparent weakness, had been calculated to lure the supremacy into using tactics that would prove utterly ineffective. But even as his fleet began to retarget their weapons, Captain Sarah Chen's voice filled the communications channel with what sounded remarkably like a sigh of disappointment. "Well, that's unfortunate," she said, her tone carrying the weariness of someone who had hoped for a different outcome. "I really did try to warn you, Admiral, but since you've made your choice." The transmission paused, and when it resumed, her voice carried a note of professional satisfaction. "Weapons Officer Harrison, you have my permission to demonstrate why the Terran Federation doesn't start fights, we finish them." The response from the human vessel was immediate and devastating. Hidden weapon ports along the Indomitable's hull suddenly blazed to life, revealing systems that their scans had somehow failed to detect. But these weren't the primitive kinetic weapons the Cathai had initially observed. These were magnetic, accelerator cannons of a scale and sophistication that defied belief. The first salvo consisted of 3 projectiles, each no larger than a human fist, fired from what appeared to be minor defensive systems. At first, Zextara thought the humans were making a desperate gesture with weapons too small to threaten his fleet. Then the projectiles reached their target velocity. A tiny percent of light speed on, he understood with crystal clarity that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The depleted uranium slugs struck the Cathai heavy cruiser Morthok with the force of controlled stellar events, traveling at relativistic speeds. The first slug punched through the cruiser's hull like it was made of tissue paper, its passage creating a perfectly circular hole that went from bow to stern without slowing down. The second and third projectiles followed microseconds later, their impacts creating a catastrophic resonance that tore the kilometer-long warship apart from the inside out. Within the span of 3 seconds, the Morthok had been reduced to an expanding cloud of debris that glowed with the heat of vaporized metal and atmosphere. "Impossible," Thelahas repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "The energy requirements for relativistic acceleration on that scale, they'd need to channel their entire power grid through those weapons." But the humans weren't finished. As the Cathai fleet watched in growing horror, the Indomitable's hull began to reconfigure itself again, revealing weapon systems that operated on principles the supremacy had never encountered. Point defense lasers emerged from hidden compartments, their targeting systems already locked onto incoming Cathai ordnance. Electronic warfare arrays began broadcasting signals that immediately started disrupting the alien fleet's communication networks. Admiral Morthok reported, his voice tight with panic. "They're jamming our command frequencies. Fleet coordination is breaking down. Individual ships are losing contact with the flag bridge." Zextara watched his tactical display dissolve into chaos as the humans, his fleet, which had operated as a coordinated unit for decades, was suddenly reduced to individual vessels fighting their own isolated battles against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. "Sir," Communications Officer Velther announced, her voice carrying a note of disbelief, "we're receiving multiple signals from the human vessel. They're talking to individual ships in our fleet, in our language, using our own tactical codes." The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't just studied Cathai military doctrine, they had penetrated their communication protocols, learned their tactical codes, and were now using that knowledge to sow confusion and discord within the fleet. Ships were receiving contradictory orders, tactical data was being corrupted, and the carefully orchestrated battle plan was collapsing into chaos. But the most disturbing revelation came from the audio intercepts that Velthar began playing over the bridge speakers. The humans weren't just fighting, they were enjoying themselves. Their communications channels were filled with what could only be described as combat enthusiasm. Crew members calling out target designations and tactical assessments with the excited professionalism of people who had found their calling, target acquired, bearing 2 Cathai destroyer class, standard configuration, initiating firing sequence. "Copy that, Gun Deck 3, replied another voice, this one carrying the authority of command. "You're cleared to engage. Make it count." The casual competence was perhaps more frightening than any weapon system. These weren't desperate defenders fighting for their lives, these were professional warriors, demonstrating their craft against opponents they had studied and prepared for. Every human voice carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was eager to prove it. All vessels, emergency scatter pattern, Zextera ordered abandoning all pretense of coordinated tactics. Individual ships are authorized to engage at will. Do not attempt to maintain formation. But the humans had anticipated this response as well, as the Cathay fleet began to break apart. The Indomitable's point defense systems came online with devastating effect. Lasers designed to intercept incoming projectiles began targeting the fleeing alien vessels with surgical precision, their beams slicing through engine sections and weapon systems with the accuracy of someone who had studied Cathay ship designs extensively. "They're not trying to destroy us," Thelahas observed, with growing horror. "They're disabling us." Of being captured and studied by a species that had demonstrated such thorough knowledge of their capabilities was far more terrifying. The humans weren't just defeating the Cathay fleet. Admiral Morthick reported, his voice barely audible, "I'm detecting additional energy signatures from the human vessel. They're not operating at full capacity. These weapon systems, the ones that just destroyed 3 of our cruisers, they're running at approximately 60% power." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Zextera's mind. The humans hadn't just prepared for this battle, they had designed it. Every element of their strategy, from their initial diplomatic approach to their apparent vulnerability, had been calculated to draw the supremacy. Fighting for survival, they were teaching a lesson. And as more Cathay vessels fell to the humans, precisely the Cathay fleet's attempt to overwhelm the human vessel through sheer numbers had devolved into a nightmare of tactical adaptation that defied every principle of warfare the supremacy had ever known. As his carefully trained cruise veterans of dozens of successful conquests found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that seemed to learn and evolve with each passing moment. "Sir Subcommander," Thelahas reported, his voice tight with disbelief, "the human vessel is modifying its weapon signatures in real time. Every shot they fire is different from the last. Our defensive systems can't adapt fast enough to counter them." The tactical display showed a pattern that would have been impossible for any conventional military force. The UES Indomitable was not merely firing at the Cathay fleet, was experimenting on them. Each magnetic accelerator round had a slightly different composition, velocity, or trajectory. The humans were systematically testing the limits of Cathay defensive capabilities, gathering data with the methodical precision of scientists conducting a laboratory experiment. "They're learning our shield harmonics," Science Officer Morthick added, his tentacles trembling as he processed the incoming data. "Each time we adjust our deflector frequencies, they compensate within seconds. It's as if they're running predictive algorithms on our defensive responses." But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the humans' technological superiority, was their apparent enjoyment of the process. The communication intercepts that Valthor continued to monitor painted a picture of a crew that was treating the battle like a complex puzzle to be solved, with each successful hit generating enthusiastic commentary from the human bridge crew. "Nice shot, Martinez," came one voice over the intercepted channels. "Clean penetration of their aft shield matrix. Mark that frequency for the tactical database." "Copy that," Commander replied, another voice, this one carrying the satisfaction of a job well done, adjusting firing solutions for the next target. The casual professionalism was more unnerving than any battle cry. These humans weren't fighting with the desperate fury of cornered animals or the cold efficiency of machines. They were fighting with the engaged enthusiasm of people who had found their calling and were eager to demonstrate their expertise. Admiral Thelahas said, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled panic, "If we can get troops onto their vessel, be able to neutralize their tactical advantages through close combat." Zextera's mandibles clicked with grim approval. The Cathay were renowned throughout the galaxy for their prowess in ship-to-ship combat. Their warrior caste had been bred for centuries to excel in the confined spaces of starship corridors, and their natural chitinous armor provided excellent protection against most small arms. If they could get boarding parties onto the human vessel, they might be able to turn the tide of battle. "Deploy assault pods," he ordered. "Target their forward sections. I want 3 full companies of our best warriors on that ship within the next 10 minutes. The boarding action began with textbook precision. Cathay assault pods armored shells designed to punch through enemy hulls and deploy troops directly into hostile territory launched from 6 different cruisers simultaneously. Their approach vectors were carefully calculated to avoid the human ship's point defense systems, and their armored hulls were rated to withstand anything short of direct hits from capital ship weapons. The first pod struck the forward hull with a resonant clang that reverberated through both vessels. Shaped charges detonated, blowing a breach in the human ship's armored plating. Through the opening, with the fluid grace of predators entering familiar territory, what they found waiting for them defied every expectation they had formed about human military capabilities. The corridor, beyond the breach, was a kill zone that had been prepared with the methodical thoroughness of engineers who understood exactly how boarding actions worked. Automated turrets emerged from hidden compartments in the walls, their targeting systems already locked onto the invading warriors. Force fields activated at regular intervals, creating choke points that funneled the Cathui into predetermined kill zones. Most disturbing of all, the humans had prepared for this exact scenario with countermeasures that suggested they had studied Cathay boarding tactics extensively. Contact. Came the voice of squad leader Vextel over the tactical channel. Human defenders are. They're using kinetic weapons, small arms fire, but the projectiles they're penetrating our combat armor. The report sent a chill through the bridge crew. Cathay battle armor was designed to stop plasma bolts and particle beams, the standard weapons of galactic warfare. But the humans were using projectile weapons that operated on such primitive principles that the armor's energy dispersal systems were useless against them. Squad 2 is down, another voice reported, this one tinged with panic. They're using explosive devices that detonate on proximity rather than impact. The blast patterns are designed specifically to exploit weak points in our armor configuration. Admiral Zexthera listened to the reports with growing dread. The humans hadn't just prepared for a boarding action, they had prepared for a boarding action by Cathay warriors specifically. Every defensive measure, every weapon system, every tactical response had been tailored to counter the supremacy's established boarding protocols. But the most disturbing reports came from the warriors who had managed to penetrate deeper into the ship. The human defenders they encountered weren't the primitive, frightened creatures the Cathay had expected. They were soldiers wearing powered armor that seemed to blend the best aspects of technology and brute force engineering. Their weapons weren't just effective, they were devastating, firing projectiles that could punch through bulkheads and armor with equal ease. "Sir," came squad leader Morthic's voice, tight with disbelief. "The human soldiers, they're enjoying this. They're actually laughing as they fight." One of them just used an explosive device to collapse a corridor section, and I heard him say something about creative problem-solving over their communications. The image of human warriors finding amusement in the midst of deadly combat was perhaps more frightening than any weapon system. It suggested a species that had not only mastered warfare, but had learned to find joy in the process of destruction and survival. All boarding parties implement emergency extraction protocols. Zexthera ordered, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. "Return to your vessels immediately." But even this retreat was anticipated by the humans. As the surviving Cathay warriors attempted to fall back to their insertion points, they found their escape routes systematically blocked by defensive systems that seemed to activate with perfect timing. Blast doors sealed shut just as they approached, forcing them to find alternate routes through corridors that the humans had obviously pre-planned to be "Sir," Velthar reported, her voice barely above a whisper, "we're intercepting human communications about the boarding action. They're calling it Training Exercise 7 Alpha. They have designation codes for different types of boarding scenarios." The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't just prepared for one type of boarding action, they had prepared for multiple scenarios, each with its own tactical designation and predetermined response protocols. The Cathay assault wasn't a surprise attack, it was a training exercise that the humans had been hoping someone would attempt. Admiral Morthic said from his science station, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had witnessed something that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. "I'm detecting additional modifications to the human vessel's structure. They're adapting their ship configuration in real time to counter our remaining tactical options." On the display, the UES Indomitable was transforming yet again, its modular construction allowing it to reconfigure itself for optimal performance. Against the specific threats the Cathay fleet represented, weapon systems were being relocated, Armor sections were being reinforced, and new defensive installations were emerging from hidden compartments throughout the ship's structure. "They're not just fighting us," the Lahas observed, his voice filled with dawning comprehension. "They're using us as a test case. Every tactic we employ, every weapon we fire, every strategy we implement there, studying it, countering it, and adding it to their tactical database for future reference." The realization that his fleet was being used as live test subjects for human military development sent Admiral Zextera into a state of cold fury. The Cathai supremacy had conquered civilizations, enslaved species, and brought order to chaotic sectors of the galaxy. They were not laboratory specimens to be studied and catalogued by primitive upstarts who had barely learned to travel between stars. "All vessels," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of desperate pride, "implement total warfare protocols. I want every weapon system, every defensive measure, every tactical option deployed simultaneously. If these humans want to study us, let..." The final gambit of the Cathai supremacy began with the systematic deployment of every military asset, tactical doctrine, and strategic weapon system that Admiral Zextera had at his disposal. 29 vessels all that remained of his once mighty fleet arranged themselves in a spherical formation around the human battleship, their combined firepower representing the accumulated military might of a civilization that had conquered 3 galactic arms. "All weapons, maximum discharge," Zextera commanded, his voice carrying the desperate authority of a commander who had run out of options. "Plasma cannons, particle beams, quantum disruptors, gravitational torpedoes, everything we have, simultaneous deployment." The resulting barrage was a display of destructive power that would have reduced most planets to molten slag. The void around the UES Indomitable became a maelstrom of exotic energies as the Cathai fleet unleashed the full spectrum of their advanced weaponry. Gravitational torpedoes warped space-time itself, creating localized distortions that should have crushed any vessel caught within their influence. Quantum disruptors attacked the fundamental forces holding matter together, while plasma cannons superheated the space around their target to temperatures that approached stellar core conditions. For a moment, even Admiral Zextera felt a surge of hope. Surely no single vessel, regardless of its design or preparation, could survive such overwhelming firepower. Deployed with mathematical precision, then the UES Indomitable did something that redefined his understanding of what was possible in space combat. Instead of attempting to evade or deflect the incoming barrage, the human vessel began to dance. Its massive hull, which had appeared cumbersome and unwieldy during their initial encounter, suddenly demonstrated a grace and agility that defied every principle of physics that Zextera thought he understood. The ship twisted through space, with movements that seemed almost organic, its modular construction allowing sections to rotate and reconfigure independently while maintaining structural integrity. "Impossible, Science Officer," Morthic whispered, his tentacles frozen over his console as he watched the sensor readings. The gravitational stresses alone should have torn that vessel apart. No ship of that mass can maneuver like that. But the human battleship was doing more than just evading the Cathai weapons, it was learning from them. As gravitational torpedoes passed through the space where the ship had been moments before, their exotic energy signatures were being analyzed and cataloged by systems that seemed to process information faster than the Cathai computers could track. Quantum disruptors that missed their target were being studied in real time, their fundamental principles apparently understood and countered within seconds of deployment. "Sir, Communications Officer," Velthar reported, her voice tight with disbelief, "we're receiving a transmission from the human vessel. It's a tactical analysis of our weapon systems. They're providing recommendations for improving our firing solutions." The transmission that followed was perhaps the most psychologically devastating attack the humans had yet deployed. Captain Sarah Chen's voice filled the bridge with the tone of a patient instructor correcting the work of enthusiastic but misguided students. "Admiral Zextera," she began, her voice carrying a note of what sounded remarkably like sympathy, "I have to say, your quantum disruptor technology is quite impressive. The theoretical framework is sound, and the implementation shows real engineering sophistication. However, you're using them incorrectly for this type of engagement. The casual critique of weapon systems that represented the pinnacle of Cathay military technology sent a chill through the bridge crew. These weren't just superior opponents, these were beings who understood the supremacy's own weapons better than the people who had built them. Your gravitational torpedoes, for instance, Captain Chen continued, her tone taking on the quality of someone giving a lecture to interested students, are calibrated for use against stationary or slow-moving targets. The field distortion patterns you're generating are too predictable for combat against vessels with adaptive maneuvering capabilities. If you adjusted the phase variance by approximately 12% and staggered the deployment timing, you might achieve better results. Admiral Zexthera stared at the tactical display in numb horror as he realized what was happening. The humans weren't just defeating his fleet, they were studying it with the methodical thoroughness of scientists dissecting a particularly interesting specimen. Every weapon system, every tactical maneuver, every desperate gambit was being analyzed, understood, and filed away for future reference. Admiral Subcommander Thelahas said, his voice barely above a whisper, "They're not trying to destroy us anymore. They're teaching us. They want us to understand what we're up against." The observation was confirmed by what happened. Next, as the Cathay fleet continued their barrage, the human vessel began to demonstrate counter-tactics in real time. When plasma cannons fired, the ship's whole configuration shifted to optimal energy absorption patterns. When particle beams targeted specific sections, point defense systems activated to create interference patterns that scattered the incoming energy. Most disturbing of all, the humans began to predict where the next attacks would come from, their defensive systems activating before the Cathay weapons had even finished charging. "They're inside our tactical computers," Morthic reported, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had witnessed something that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. "Somehow, they've gained access to our targeting systems. They know what we're going to fire before we fire it." But the true scope of the humans' capabilities became clear when Captain Chen's voice returned to the communications channel, this time carrying a note of what sounded like genuine concern. "Admiral, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this engagement," she said, her tone taking on the quality of someone attempting to prevent unnecessary tragedy. "You seem to believe that you're fighting a military action against a peer opponent. But that's not what this is." The pause that followed was filled with the sound of Cathay, weapons continuing their futile barrage against a target that seemed to anticipate and counter every attack with casual efficiency. "This is an educational demonstration," Captain Chen continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had complete control of the situation. "We're not your enemies, Admiral. We're your teachers. And the lesson we're trying to impart is very simple. Humanity doesn't start conflicts, but we finish them. We don't seek war, but we excel at it. We don't want to destroy you, but we are prepared to do so if you leave us no choice." The transmission paused again, and in that silence, Admiral Zexthara could hear the background sounds of the human bridge crew continuing their work with the calm professionalism of people who had done this many times before. Orders were being given in measured tones, tactical assessments were being shared with the casual confidence of experts in their field. And through it all, there was an underlying current of what could only be described as satisfaction. "You scanned our ship, Admiral," Captain Chen resumed, her voice now carrying a note of what sounded like regret. "You saw our capabilities, our preparations, our crew. But you didn't understand what you were looking at. You saw redundant systems and called them inefficient. You saw adaptive weapons and called them primitive. You saw a crew preparing for battle and assumed they were afraid." The tactical display showed the human vessel continuing its impossible dance through space, its movements now so fluid and graceful that it seemed to be mocking the Cathay's attempts to target it. "But what you actually saw," Captain Chen continued, her voice taking on the quality of someone delivering a final judgment, "was the end result of centuries of human military evolution. You saw a species that has learned to turn every weakness into a strength, every failure into a lesson, every defeat into preparation for victory. You saw what happens when a civilization decides that survival isn't enough. They must learn to thrive in conditions that would destroy lesser species." The transmission ended, leaving the Cathay bridge in stunned silence. Admiral Zexthera stared at the tactical display, watching as his fleet's weapons continued their futile assault. Against a target that seemed to have transcended the normal limitations of space combat, the humans weren't just superior warriors, they were a species that had weaponized their own capacity for adaptation and learning. Sir Thelaha said quietly, "Our ammunition reserves are approaching critical levels. If we continue this engagement, we'll be completely defenseless within the next 10 minutes. But Zexthera barely heard him. His attention was focused on a realization that was slowly crystallizing in his mind. An understanding that redefined everything he thought he knew about warfare, technology, and the nature of civilization itself. Humans had turned their entire species into a weapon. Not just their military, not just their technology, but their fundamental approach to existence. They had learned to see every challenge as an opportunity to grow stronger, every enemy as a teacher, every defeat as preparation for future victory. They were not just another species with advanced technology. They were evolution itself, given consciousness and set loose upon the galaxy. And the silence that followed the end of hostilities was more profound than any sound Admiral Zexthera had ever experienced. 29 Cathay vessels hung motionless in space, their weapon systems depleted, their crews stunned into paralysis by the magnitude of their defeat. Around them, the debris of 19 destroyed warships drifted in expanding clouds of vaporized metal and crystallized atmosphere, silent testimony to the futility of challenging a species that had mastered the art of turning conflict into education. The UES Indomitable sat at the center of the battlefield, like a patient teacher waiting for her students to process the lesson they had just received. Her hull showed minimal battle damage, a few scorch marks from plasma impacts, some minor armor scoring from particle beam hits, but nothing that suggested she had been engaged in mortal combat against an entire fleet. If anything, the human vessel looked refreshed, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a beneficial exercise routine. Sir Subcommander Thelahas said quietly, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had witnessed the collapse of everything he had believed about military superiority, were receiving another transmission from the human vessel. Admiral Zexthera S. Mandibles clicked once, a sound that conveyed resignation rather than authority. There was no point in refusing to listen. The humans had demonstrated their ability to communicate with individual ships in his fleet, to penetrate their tactical networks, to understand their technology better than they understood it themselves. If Captain Chen wanted to speak, she would be heard regardless of his preferences. "Audio," he commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Sarah Chen's voice filled the bridge with the same calm confidence that had characterized all her previous communications, but now it carried an additional quality, the patience of someone who had successfully concluded a difficult but necessary task. "Admiral Zexthera," she began, her tone carrying what sounded like genuine respect. "I want you to know that your fleet fought with honor. Your tactical coordination was excellent, your crew discipline was impressive, and your weapons technology showed real innovation. In another context, under different circumstances, the Cathay supremacy would be a formidable military force." The praise felt like salt in an open wound. To be complimented by an enemy who had just demonstrated their complete technological and tactical superiority was somehow more humiliating than simple defeat. However, Captain Chen continued, her voice taking on the quality of someone delivering a carefully prepared statement. "I need you to understand what you've just witnessed. This engagement wasn't a battle between equals. It wasn't even a battle between superior and inferior forces. What you experienced was a demonstration of what happens when a species chooses to make warfare its primary focus of technological and social development." The transmission paused, and in that silence, Admiral Zexthera could hear the background sounds of the human bridge. Crew conducting post-battle analysis with the same methodical efficiency they had brought to the combat itself. Data was being cataloged, tactical assessments were being filed, and lessons learned were being integrated into what was obviously a vast database of military knowledge. "Humanity didn't choose to become warriors, Admiral," Captain Chen resumed, her voice now carrying a note of what sounded like sadness. "We were forced into it by circumstances beyond our control. Our homeworld was a death trap that tried to kill us in every way imaginable. Our climate was unstable, our geology was violent, our biology was fragile, and our ecosystem was filled with predators that were faster, stronger, and better adapted than we were." The human captain's words painted a picture of a species had been forged by adversity in ways that the Kethahu had evolved on a stable world with abundant resources had never experienced. We learned to fight because we had to. We learned to adapt because the alternative was extinction. We learned to turn every disadvantage into an advantage because that was the only way we could survive. And when we finally reached the stars, we brought all of those lessons with us. Admiral Zexthara found himself listening with growing comprehension. The humans' approach to warfare wasn't the result of aggressive expansion or militaristic culture. It was the product of a species that had spent millions of years learning to survive in conditions that would have destroyed most civilizations. Ship you scanned, Admiral, the UES, Indomitable, isn't just a battleship. It's a repository of human military knowledge accumulated over centuries of conflict. Every system, every weapon, every tactical capability represents lessons learned from wars you can't imagine. We've fought ourselves, we've fought our environment, we've fought extinction itself, and we've won every time. The transmission paused, again, and when it resumed, Captain Chen's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. You asked what our intentions were in this system. The answer is simple. We came here to explore, to learn, to hopefully establish peaceful contact with new civilizations. We didn't come here to conquer or to destroy. We came here to extend the hand of friendship to anyone willing to accept it. The irony was not lost on Admiral Zexthara. The humans had offered peaceful contact, and the Cathai had responded with aggression. The species that had mastered warfare had sought peace, while the species that prided itself on conquest had chosen conflict. But you forced us to defend ourselves, Captain Chen continued, her voice now carrying a note of finality. And in doing so, you've learned something that I hope you'll share with the rest of the galaxy. Humanity doesn't start fights, but we finish them. We don't seek war, but we excel at it. We don't want enemies, but we are prepared to deal with them if they threaten our people or our values. The main display flickered, showing a tactical overview of the battle from the human perspective. Admiral Zexthara watched in fascination as the engagement was replayed from the UES Indomitable's sensors, revealing the methodical precision with which the humans had dismantled his fleet. Every move had been calculated, every response had been anticipated, every outcome had been planned for. This data package contains our complete tactical analysis of this engagement, Captain Chen explained. It includes assessments of your weapon systems, your tactical doctrine, your crew performance, and your strategic decision-making. We're sharing this information with you not as an insult, but as a gift. Learn from it, study it, use it to become better than you were. The generosity of the gesture was perhaps more devastating than any weapon. The humans were not only superior warriors, they were superior teachers, willing to share their knowledge with former enemies in the hopes of preventing future conflicts. Admiral Captain Chen said, her voice taking on a personal quality, I want you to carry a message back to the Cathai supremacy. Tell them that humanity has arrived in the galaxy, and we're not going away. Tell them that we're prepared to be the best friends they've ever had, or the worst enemies they've ever faced. The choice is theirs. The transmission ended, leaving the Cathai bridge in stunned silence. Admiral Zexthara stared at the tactical display, processing the implications of what he had just experienced. The humans had defeated his fleet, studied his people's capabilities, and then offered to teach them how to become better warriors. It was a display of confidence and generosity that transcended anything he had encountered in his military career. Sir, communications officer, said quietly, we're receiving similar transmissions from other human vessels. They're broadcasting on all frequencies, in multiple languages, throughout this sector of space. The message that followed was brief but comprehensive. It was a formal announcement from the Terran Federation informing the galaxy of humanity's presence and intentions. The humans were declaring themselves open for diplomatic contact, offering technological exchange, cultural dialogue, and mutual cooperation with any species willing to approach them in peace. But embedded within the diplomatic language was a warning that no civilization could ignore. The humans had demonstrated their military capabilities to anyone who cared to observe. They had shown that they were prepared to defend themselves against any threat, regardless of its size or sophistication. Most importantly, they had proven that they were a species that treated warfare not as a last resort, but as a field of study that they had mastered with the same thoroughness they brought to any other discipline. Admiral Science Officer Morthick said, his voice carrying a note of awe, "I'm detecting multiple human vessels throughout this system. They're not just explorers, they're colonists. They're here to stay." The realization that humanity was not just visiting the galaxy but claiming a permanent place in it sent a chill through the bridge crew. The humans had announced their arrival, not with diplomacy or negotiation, but with a demonstration of power that left no doubt about their intentions or capabilities. "Set course for Cathay space," Admiral Zextara commanded, his voice carrying the weight of defeat and hard-won. "Wisdom, emergency transmission to Supremacy Command, Priority Alpha." As the surviving vessels of his fleet began their journey home, Admiral Zextara composed the most important message of his career. It was a warning, a recommendation, and a plea all in one. The Cathay Supremacy had encountered a species that redefined the nature of galactic civilization, who,